Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary. On Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name, salvation has been brought down.
All right, so as we pick up very quickly, a little review just to get our minds back to what we were discussing. We talked about some of the attributes last week, the attributes of angels. We talked about their free will, free moral agents, just as we are. They had the ability to choose. Many of them, Satan himself, many of his angels, potentially all of them. We don't know how many, but at least a portion of his angels chose sin as well, followed him, and were cast out of that heavenly abode. Can you imagine being there and experiencing heaven and then losing that? Only something that Satan and those angels will ever experience. We talked about their intelligence. King David was described on multiple occasions in 2 Samuel 14, 2 verses listed there, where they talked about David being wiser than angels. Right? Not that it's possible for a man to literally be wiser than angels, but it was a hyperbole. It was an exaggerated statement. He's so wise, it's as though he were as wise as the angels in heaven. We talked about their emotion, that they can have even greater joy in moments, especially when someone who is that lost sheep repents. They confess sin, and just as the young lady did Sunday, Miss Brianna, and angels in heaven rejoice in those moments. They're excited and they're very happy and joyful. They shouted for joy, Job 38:7, at the creation as well. Then we talked about their strength, very powerful beings. Their swiftness, they're very fast. Their wings, the idea is that they can be somewhere very quickly if they need to be, and can leave there very quickly. And they are genderless. There's no marriage in heaven, no marriage between angels. There's no man and woman. There's only spiritual beings, and all of us of which will just be one great family, free from that desire, the desires of the flesh that would be involved here in this lifetime. And so we get to where we ended last week. We talked about their worship. We know that angels worship God, cherubim, seraphim alike, especially seraphim that we see referenced there worshiping God. We talked about them guarding heaven, right? There are 12 gates as described there in that image, and these angels are guarding heaven, the cherubim specifically mentioned. And then we concluded right here with carrying out judgment. This is where we ended. Angels carry out the judgment of God, and we mean that judgment in the negative sense there, as in someone's time is up, and the angels administer that judgment. Genesis 3:24, it was in the garden as Adam and Eve had sinned, and that was it. They were taken out of the garden, and so that cherub was, or cherubim, if there were more than one there, placed in the garden, and the flaming sword, probably an angel as well, that were guarding the tree of life. Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. Who was it that came down to Lot, who got him out of the city before the hell and brimstone rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah? It were angels. It was angels that did that. The angels fulfilling God's purpose through that judgment. And then Matthew 13 as well. Let's jump down. I don't want to spend too much time on review. Let's jump to Revelation 20 and pick up now where we left off. Revelation chapter 20. Again, we're focusing on this particular portion on their heavenly ministry, what they're doing from heaven, how God is using them. And some of this they came down to earth to do, but it was, of course, coming from God. And we're going to switch gears and talk about earthly ministry in a moment. But before we do, look at Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. One of the most powerful, you might say, moments that we see angels executing. I saw an angel, John says, writing here, come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. Right? Figurative language here, apocryphal language. Verse 2, and he laid hold on the dragon, the old serpent, which is the devil. Again, he doesn't leave that open for us to try to guess. Who is the dragon? He tells us. He is laying hold on the dragon, which is the devil, Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. Cast him into the bottomless pit, shut him up, set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled, and after that he would be loosed a little season. Okay, very figurative language, not easily just to read those 3 verses. It's not easy to read those and just know exactly what John is referencing. But there are a few things that we know about figurative language, about symbols in the Bible. For example, the term there or phrase 1,000 years. What do we know about the number 10 or the number 100 or the number 1,000 and so on? You remember we did a study on numbers? See, yeah, it's very symbolic. These are very symbolic. They're very round numbers. And they're basically, in short, they're one of the 4 numbers of perfection. It's the idea of completion. And so Satan is going to be bound a full time, a full period, a perfect amount of time, whatever it is, and not necessarily literally 1,000 years. Verse 3, they're going to, there on the PowerPoint. They're going to, the end of verse 1, they are going to come down. It's the angel that's going to do this and bind him. Now, when you think of binding Satan, what comes to your mind? Where are times or moments in the Bible where you see Satan being bound? Is it? Okay, good. Great example. Persecution of Job. You think about when Satan was wanting to just do that, persecute him, to cause him struggles. Remember, he says to God, "You've got this hedge built around Job. If you'd let me touch him, he wouldn't be so faithful to you, God." Right? And God says, he's kind of, I don't know if taunting is the right word, but he's telling Satan, "Consider my servant Job. He eschews evil. He is faithful to me in every way." And so he begins to give Satan, he loosens up on the binding, on the bounds that he has on him. And so he lets Satan hurt his family. He doesn't touch Job to begin with. But in time, as that progresses, God then lets Satan lay a hand on Job. He's able to put those boils. So God's binding Satan. He controls how much power He's going to allow Satan to have, what He's going to allow him to get away with. In the first century, Satan had more power than he does now. How do we know that? What could Satan do in the first century that he cannot do now? Yes. Exactly. He literally could possess people. He and his angels, his demons, they could possess someone, cause them to lose control, cause them to remember some of the things: foaming at the mouth, living in a cave, crazy strength, very ill and sick, running around in the streets naked. And now we see some folks doing that today. It's not because of a demon, though. It may remind you of that, but that's not why they're doing it. Right? So he had those abilities. But again, we remember that their purpose was for what? Why did God allow those demons to inhabit those people? John 20, 30 and 31. Yeah. For His glory. Christ could cast them out. Those miracles. Yes, ma'am. Yes. That's right. At the very beginning. At the very beginning. He tempted Eve. He certainly did. And so God allowed him to have that power, to use that power, and to possess folks. And in doing so, in removing those demons, he was confirming the Word with these miracles, with these signs. John 20, 30, and 31. And we get to read about them, as John says there, so that we can learn, and so that we can see that through the words of the Bible. We know from 1 Corinthians 13, 10 and following that those miracles ceased once the Bible came. But that's another study. And so we get to Matthew 12. Matthew 12, 29. Let's turn to this one together. This is the reference here to, you remember when, in fact, this has to do with Jesus casting out demons. And you remember the discussion about how Jesus, they're calling him Satan and Beelzebub, Satan himself. And he says to them, that doesn't make even any sense, because if I cast out devils and I'm Satan, then a kingdom, he explains to them, that's divided against itself can't what? It can't stand. It doesn't make sense for the king to be fighting against himself here. So Jesus says, I'm not Beelzebub. But in verse 29, he goes on to explain, or else, how can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he first bind the strong man, then he will spoil his house. Satan possessing these people, their bodies, their house. If Christ is going to go in and he's going to remove this demon from that house, he's got to first bind the who? The owner of the house, the strong man, right? The owner of the home, Satan. So Christ says, I'm binding him. His power is limited. And so I am able to remove these demons because God has bound his power. In fact, that word spoil his power, spoil his house, is also used in Colossians 2. I'll just read it quickly, if I can get there quickly. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. Probably remember from our Sunday morning Bible class. He says, and this is about the cross. He nailed the Old Testament to the cross, verse 14. Verse 15, having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. He spoiled principalities and powers. When Christ died on that cross and was resurrected, times were going to change. The new law was going to be now in effect, Hebrews 9 and about verse 15 through 17. Things were changing, and the miraculous age was going to end, and there was going to be a movement. The Word of God was being written, and so the power that Satan had continued to be bound. Here's the point of all of this. God used angels in some sense. God, through angels, bound Satan's power. He bound him. He began to take away some of the freedoms that he had given Satan to do in the first century, just like he did with Job, but in the sense of possessing us. Is that making some sense? And again, how did he use the angels to do that? I don't know. But according to Revelation, it was angels that bound him. Maybe that in and of itself is figurative, but something of interest that I don't want to leave out. Any thoughts about this? Yes, sir.
We have the same power today to bind Satan. But we're told resist the devil and he'll flee from you.
Yep, that's a very good point. That's really exactly right. We bind him in that sense because God promises, God who cannot lie, Titus 1 and verse 2, if we resist Satan, if we resist the devil, he'll what? He'll flee. And if he flees from us, the necessary inference is when he flees, what's not going to be happening? At least for a time. Yeah, that's sin. He's not going to be tempting us, at least not with that, because we've resisted that and we're going to be all right for a time. May tempt us in another way, may come back and try again later, but at that moment, we're going to resist that sin because we've resisted him, and he fled from us. All right, let's talk about the earthly ministry now. How that God uses angels here on earth, and ultimately we'll get to us today. In the Old Testament, and again, we mentioned this before, keep in mind that the Greek word for angel is angelos. And remember, what is it called when the translators take a word in the Greek that we have a word for it in the English, but instead of translating it, they just take angelos and spell it A-N-G-E-L and call it angel and make up that word. What is that called? Transliteration. It's a transliteration. The translation of the word angelos is what? What does the term angel really mean? Messenger. It's not just necessarily heavenly beings. It's a messenger. That's why when we read Revelation 2:1 and following and 3:1 and following, the angel of the church at Laodicea, the angel of the church at Pergamos and Smyrna and all of those that are there, those are men. Those are messengers from God that are writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be an angel. It literally just means a messenger. And so it makes sense that God would use them to deliver messages. Something that was pointed out to me that it wasn't brought up in class, it was brought up after that, just to kind of throw in there something to think about. I thought it was a good point. When we were discussing angels not being created before day one, someone brought up to me, and I thought it was a very, very good point, that, again, one of the major purposes of angels was to deliver messages, and there would have been no messages or no need for messages to be delivered from God to man because we did not exist. And so it certainly seems that even more that the evidence would suggest that the angels were created during those 6 days, probably at the beginning, and not before then. I thought that was an interesting point, and I wanted to share that. But Genesis 16 and verse 7, Hagar. Hagar was despised, the word is used there, by her mistress Sarah. And so Hagar flees. She runs away, she goes out, and who is it that comes to Hagar and delivers a message to her? It's an angel. It's an angel. And the angel tells her what? Do you remember? What was the message that God delivered through this angel? What was God's instructions for her? Return. Return to thy mistress. Go back to her. And in fact, she is going to have a what? She's going to have a child. And that child will be Ishmael. And of course, that was the whole reason she went to Abraham. Sarah wanted her to do that, to have a child. Yes, sir. Yes. Right. Yes, at the very beginning of creation. We know that they were there, Job 26:7, I think it is. We know that they were there and they were at the creation. And the evidence seems to be that they were created probably day one, at the very beginning. And then they would have seen the rest of the creation of the world. There's no evidence to suggest that there was anything created before day one. And so it seems more far-fetched to say that God created something before creation when the Bible says that everything was created in those 6 days. And so it seems that I guess the logical conclusion would be that they were towards the beginning if they witnessed the earth being created and the people as well. But they were certainly there when man was created. And immediately Satan went down and tempted them. But yeah, I see what you mean. I kind of backtracked there, and without being here in those classes, it could easily be confusing. I apologize for the confusion there. Acts 27, just another example, verse 22 there. You see the angel coming to Paul, and he tells the ship, things were getting out of hand. Men were beginning to be afraid, and Paul says, listen, the angel of God has been here. He stood by me, and he told me that not a single one of us are going to lose our life when this ship goes down. The ship's going to go down, but we will be spared. God will be with us. And so angels delivered messages to them. Now, did they, in all cases, see the angel that was speaking to them? Maybe I should phrase it this way. Did they always see a spiritual angel? Sometimes he was in the form of a man. Sometimes they were granted vision. And sometimes we don't necessarily know that they even saw them, but they heard the voice of these angels. They would deliver messages to them. Today, do we see angels? What is some of biblical evidence? Because this is a serious subject. You talk to a lot of folks who will suggest that they've seen an angel, that they've talked with an angel. Biblically, how do we know that angels would not speak to us today? I'm sorry? Galatians 1, that's right. Galatians 1, there's a few passages we could reference. Galatians 1 stands out, verses 6 through 9. Paul says, even if an angel would speak to you, right? First of all, why would he? We have everything we need. So we don't need the angels to tell us anything. Everything's here. The Bible makes that clear. And if an angel said something that wasn't in the Bible, what does Paul say to do with that message? Let it be accursed. Throw it out. It's no good. God does not allow the demons to give us messages today, and certainly the angels in heaven are not going to do that. That's contrary to His will. And so we see that angels would not deliver messages today in the same way that they did then. Now they have purposes today, and they're working, but not to deliver vocal messages to us. Yes, sir?
That conflicts with the Mormon doctrine that the angel came down and told
Joseph Smith.
where the golden tablets were.
That's right. Yep. Joseph Smith claims that he did. He saw an angel, spoke with an angel, even claims that he saw God, and that he had these tablets and the whole story therein. It does. It absolutely conflicts with that teaching. Very misled. They also. Oh, I'm sorry, Terry. Yes. Well, and I believe it was Jesus Himself, wasn't it, that first spoke to Mary in the tomb? Or I'd have to go back and somebody correct me. I got a few faces there. I must be wrong on that.
Yeah, the angel said He's not here.
The angel said He's not here. That's right. But she confronts Jesus at some point. She sees Him. But Matthew 28, verse number 5 there. Yeah, the angel answered and said to the women, "Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, which is crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Come see the place where He lay." And then Jesus enters the picture a little bit later there in Matthew 28. So yeah, at the beginning it was an angel. I apologize. Thank you, gentlemen, for correcting me on that. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? All right, Daniel chapter 8. Another thing that angels did was explained visions. We see them explaining visions. This is just one example. Daniel 8, 16 and 17. And again, I've told you before, reading through these visions in Daniel from chapter 7 on, 90% of the time, these visions are referencing Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greeks, Roman Empire. All of 4 of them, 2 of them, 1 of them, and of course, ultimately, God's kingdom. And that's the whole message of Daniel from chapter 7 on and in chapter 2, is that there's going to be an eternal kingdom that will not end. It's prophecy about the church. That's what it's about. So in Daniel 8, you see this vision, and in this one, it's a ram with 2 horns, and one horn is higher than the other, and then there's a goat with 1 horn, and that's the vision. And as we've kind of discussed it before, just in study skills and kind of seeing connections and things that are repeated, what country or which of the 4 kingdoms had 2 parts and one was higher than the other or a little more powerful than the other? You remember which one? Which of the 4 between Babylon, Medes and Persians? Remember the bear, Revelation, the bear's on one side, right? It's the same idea. This ram has 2 horns, one is higher than the other. Medes and Persians were the greater kingdom. And so it's just a different animal. It's another way of saying the same thing. Then the goat, same thing, kind of like the leopard. It's quick. It has 1 horn. There was 1 primary king that led this conquering of the land, and who was that? Who also was prophesied about in Ezekiel as well for destroying Tyre. Who led the Greeks? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great seems to best fit. But again, the angel comes down and he doesn't say Alexander the Great, but he explains to them that these are kingdoms. These are men, these horns, and that they represent the furtherance of these kingdoms as you read through the rest of chapter 8. So the angels did that. That was something. They delivered messages and they explained messages, you might say, explained visions to help them better understand, which ultimately were messages as well. I didn't know how to put this. I kind of said the angels were on call because there's so many assorted, miscellaneous things that God had angels do on earth. For example, Daniel in the lion's den. What happened when he was thrown into that lion's den for praying to God? Was he killed by the lions? No. Why wasn't he? The angel stayed their mouth. The lions couldn't do anything. An angel was there. So God sent that angel down to protect Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're in the fiery furnace. And when Nebuchadnezzar looks in, what does he see? There's a 4th person. There's a 4th man, and it's the angel. They come out. They don't even smell. What a picture of salvation. They come out of the fire, and they don't even smell like it, much less no burn or anything on them. That picture of salvation there. Acts 12 is up there, verse 7. How did Peter get out of prison? How was it that his shackles fell off of his hands? He got all of his clothes and just walked right out of there without any opposition. How did he do that? It was an angel. An angel. God sending these angels. That's right. That's right. In Acts 8 and verse 26, you think about Philip. Philip joined himself to the eunuch. How did Philip know that the eunuch was there, that he was reading Isaiah and that he needed assistance? Who came to him and told him? An angel of the Lord. Angel of the Lord. And so the Holy Spirit, they're getting him to go and to join himself to the chariot. So God used angels for purposes of furthering salvation. Peter was an evangelist, and Philip was an evangelist, and ultimately it's all about these men going out and continuing to labor for God and protecting them. But on the flip side, they were also on call, if I can put it that way, to execute what God consequences, or basically to hinder the works of evil. Maybe that's the best way to put it. God used them to hinder the works of evil. Another example, back to Sodom and Gomorrah, when a wicked city. And not that our nation today is not heading in this direction. I get it. But that aside, very, very wicked city, nation. And you think of these men who are banging on the door because they want to know adults. They want to know these visitors, these new men that have come into this house. And what do we know about these men that are in that house? They were angels. They were angels. And these men are pounding on the door trying to get in. Lot, without just opening up that can of worms, Lot offers his daughters to them. I don't understand that, but that's what he did. He offered his daughters. And what do the angels do to protect Lot? They blind them. So they had some freedom there. God allowed them to blind those men. And so again, God uses them to protect Lot, not only from His judgment, fire and brimstone, but from the sins of these people that were going to abuse them in the sense that you understand. Psalm 78:49. Let's turn to this one. Psalm 78:49. When you think about the plagues of Israel, or at least when I do, I don't normally think of the angels. I think about God, or I think about Moses and Aaron. And again, we've been talking about recently that Aaron was primarily the one that actually did the miracles. They worked through Aaron. He was the one that was using the staff, but it's normally depicted in media as being Moses. But remember, Moses was very nervous, and so God said, I'm going to allow Aaron to do that. He'll be your spokesman, and he will use that staff. And so Moses was there with him, and much is done through Aaron as well. However, how did God use His power through Aaron and through Moses and through this staff? Well, apparently some angels were involved. Psalm 78 and verse 49. Somebody that's there, please read that for us. Excellent. If you read back a little further, prior to that, he references the plagues, many of the plagues. Verse 48, for example, cattle, hail, and thunderbolts. And so verse 49, he's using these angels of destruction to do that. Now, where in Exodus does the Bible say that angels were involved with these plagues? Do you ever see the Bible say that God used the angels for the plagues? I haven't noticed it. I've not seen that passage. But so we have some supplemental information here. Does that contradict what the Bible says in Exodus? No, but in some sense, God used those angels to work those miracles through Moses and Aaron. Very, very interesting. And He calls them angels of destruction. Do you think those angels had a specific, a special training? You know, you think about the military, and each of them has special operations. Do you think these angels were destructive angels, and when He needed destruction, He called on them? Or do you think they're angels of destruction because at that moment God used them to destroy? Yes, ma'am. Evil, like King James Version says, evil angels. And that you can imagine the questions that are posed there. Do you think that, I wondered if that might get brought up, do you think that God used demons here to evil angels in that sense? Probably not. I don't think there's any evidence of that. God, He could have done that, but we don't ever see God using demons, controlling them, forcing them to do. He never takes away their free will by any means. And so they would not want to help God, of course, unfortunately. So here we've got these angels that God used for destruction. I like that translation. Whatever translation that was a good way to put it. But angels were involved. Acts 12 and verse 23. You remember Herod. King Herod died his body underwent quite a horrible time after he died. But who was it that took Herod's life? For his arrogance, for his pride, An angel. An angel took his life, and then his body, what happened to his body? Eaten by worms, right? Reminds us of hell, the worm that dieth not, eaten by worms. What a horrible, horrible experience. Let's keep going. Any other thoughts so far? I'm moving quickly. There's so much, just so little time and so much to discuss with these angels. Let's get into something. I would call this slide the section that maybe has more questions than we can answer. But Luke 16, here's some other things we know about them, but there are a lot of questions that the Bible does not answer about these particular points that we're about to see. Luke 16, beginning in verse 19. There was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. There was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores, desiring to be fed with crumbs, which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Verse 22, here's the key. It came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by who into Abraham's bosom? Angels. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell he lifted up his eyes, being in torments. The word there for hell is Hades, not the lake of fire hell. How do we know, I believe we've discussed this before, how do we know that this is not a parable and that this is an actual account that occurred? Names are mentioned. This man is named Lazarus. This is not a parable. Christ never named folks in a parable. It was a made-up story. He didn't. We might make up stories when we make up names when we write stories today, but Christ did not do that. And so it helps us to differentiate. This is a true story. So when Lazarus died, he was taken where we know is the waiting place for eternity. And how did he go? How does his spirit get guided from here to there? What a beautiful picture that angels carried him into a better place. But you know what's interesting to me? Not that that isn't. But on top of that, how did the rich man get to torment? It doesn't say angels carried him there, does it? It just says he opened up his eyes and there he was. I don't even want to know how. I don't want to know how he got there. I don't want to think about that trip. But I imagine the angels of heaven did not come down and take. I don't know. But it does not say that angels carried him. I don't think we want to even know the answer to that question. But very interesting. So angels, when we die, the picture seems to be that that's what's going to happen. Angels will carry us into heaven. And what a beautiful picture. That's about all we know about that. Any thoughts or questions or concerns about that particular point? Other than we at least were told that much. Yes, sir. There are. There sure is. In fact, later in that very chapter, in this very reading, he mentions it. And because the rich man wanted Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool the tip of his tongue, the rich man's tongue, but Abraham tells him, you can't pass. The guys from here can't go there. Guys from there can't go here because there's a great gulf in between us. Yes, sir.
One thing that Victor brought up was one of his lessons was that in hell, you get lonely. And kind of like you'll be around those pals,
Yeah.
and the pals, they all get struggle together. Things like that. So we all,
Yeah. That's right.
you won't be able to have your pals around or anybody else for that matter. You'll be alone
Yeah.
in darkness.
Complete darkness. You won't be able to see your hand in front of your face. Outer darkness, as it's described. Solar system, outer darkness. No light whatsoever. But we will hear, but it will not be a pleasant hearing, will it?
And you'll remember.
And you'll remember. Yeah. You'll remember the opportunities you missed out on. Yes, ma'am. I've heard of this. Yes. Yep. They turn the lights off. When you get to that place, they turn the lights off, and they say it is complete. Whew. I'm not very scared of the dark, but that makes me very afraid. And some folks are scared of the dark. I just can't even imagine. Moving on. They are involved. I'm just kidding. If there's any other thoughts, we'll certainly take them. But we know that they're involved with God's providence. Hebrews 1:14. We talked. Somebody referenced it, I think, last week. They are ministering spirits. They minister to us today. We don't see them. They don't speak to us. But again, God working through His providence. And again, we use that term pro there, coming from this Latin. It's before. It means to basically see before. He sees beforehand. And so He is using the opportunities, the things that happen today to help us with the future. He's involved in working. And He's using the angels for that in some capacity. But He doesn't tell us exactly how. We saw how they worked of old. And we could, I'll give you some things that we could presume that they do for us in a different way. For example, Acts 8:26. The angel told Philip to go speak to the eunuch. Do you believe that God, when someone is looking for the truth, that God will providentially make sure that they run into somebody that could teach them? Absolutely. Absolutely. Very possible that He uses His angels in some way for that. Again, we live in a different, we don't live in the age of miracles, we live in the age of faith. And faith is believing in that which we don't see. We don't see the miracles, we don't see the angels, we don't see Christ as they did. But we believe and have faith, and we know that they still minister to us. Luke 22:43, Jesus was in the garden, and He was hurting. He was mentally hurting. He was just absolutely anxious, the anxiety, the stress, what He was about to go through. It was as though sweat was mixed with blood coming out of His pores. And an angel came to Him and did what? Strengthened Him. Strengthened Him. Do you believe that God strengthens us today? Absolutely. Maybe somewhat. There's no way. Maybe some way through His angels. Did you have a thought, Larry?
On that providence, we have to be very careful, I think, because there's some today who say they go into a hospital not knowing anybody, and somehow they're told to go into this room to talk to this person.
Yep. That's not providence. That's direct communication there. Well, and that's part of the thinking, and that was something the Holy Spirit did. That was something that He did at that time. But today, working just within the laws of nature, nothing in the miraculous age that would happen, but today it would not. And that's a deeper study, and we can chat about it more. I'm sure we will. But there doesn't seem to be evidence today that the Spirit would directly put a thought into our mind outside of what we have here, because again, everything that we need is right here. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that some more. It's not too far from the truth. I think there's just a little dividing line there. One other passage here on this point, Psalm 91. In fact, let's turn over to this one as well. Psalm 91. But not to be misunderstood. I do believe that the Spirit is working and that these angels are working. It's just different. It's different than it was in the first century for many reasons. Psalm 91 verse 11. Angels often protected, like they did Daniel. And Psalm 91:11, you know this passage. For He shall give His angels charge over thee. It's what Satan misquoted to Jesus. He'll give His angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways. They shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. The angels will keep you, guard you, in other words. Again, does God protect us? Absolutely. Does He? How does He do that? Well, maybe He does that with the angels as well, just in a different capacity or way than He did before. One other thought, Daniel 10 here, and then we're going to have to conclude, and if there's any other thoughts, we'll take them. One last thing, and this is the one, I saved this one for last for tonight, because this is the one that poses the most questions probably, and I'll just go ahead and tell you that I'm not going to know the answer. Daniel 10 and verse 13, I don't know any other place in the Scripture that gives us more information on this. But in Daniel 10, there's some interaction here between Daniel and these angels, even more so. Daniel 10 and verse 13. The prince, and again, these princes we've talked about before are angels. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, archangel, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. The prince as an angel of the kingdom of Persia. What does that seem to infer? The angel of the kingdom of Persia. Why would it say of the kingdom of Persia? What does that infer as you read that? Yeah, countries have angels. That's a popular belief because of this. This angel in some sense was or had authority over Persia. I don't know. I don't know all that entails, but I know what it says there in verse 13. If you jump down to verse 20, you see a little more. Then said he, knowest thou wherefore I come unto thee? You know why I'm coming to you. Now I'll return to fight with the prince of Persia. Don't miss it. And when I'm gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. Seems to be a different angel, different country. But I will show thee that which is noted in the Scripture of truth, and there is none that holds with me these things but Michael, your prince. In some sense, in this time, these angels had, or there were angels, or maybe one angel that had some kind of authority over the nations. I don't know. I don't know much more than that. But again, we're studying angels, and there's some reference to that. Anybody ever done further study on this particular area, or know any other passages that I may have just overlooked that would give us a little more information on angels and nations? Some believe that the angels do guard nations today. In fact, they believe that we have personal guardian angels. And that is, Lord willing, what we're going to discuss next week. Guardian angels. And we'll talk a little more about these nations. And I think a lot of this is going to tie in together. But interested to see if there were any comments or thoughts about it. Our time is up, and if there's nothing else, we will dismiss for a few. Yes, sir. A couple more. We haven't discussed that. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned it because we might have some time to talk a little about that next week too, along with the guardian angels, because there is some evidence that the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament was deity, was either Jesus or God. Most would say Jesus, because he accepted worship. And so we'll look at some of those references. That's a great question, Glenn, and then we'll conclude.
Many of you know my mother-in-law Gladys. She sees angels.
Yep.
She also concludes those are hallucinations because it's genetic.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know where he was going with that. Yep. There are some that believe they do. And a lot of times there's drugs involved, but a lot of times.
Along that way, Emily sees angels every time our grandchildren come over.
Yeah, well said. I thought he was going to call you an angel. He didn't, though, did he? We'll pause for a few moments and then reconvene for